The events unfold in a grand mansion. A disheveled and terrified girl bursts out of a room. She grabs a passing staff member's arm, pleading for help. The woman genuinely doesn't understand what happened, as just a few hours ago she was delighted about Director Jang's arrival. The poor girl shakes her head vigorously, explaining she can't take it anymore. The man didn't chase after the girl. Instead, he discussed a serious deal. The person on the other end of the phone announced that there were news to lift his spirits. Early in the morning, Seo Su-won, the protagonist, arrived at the designated place to ensure that an extraordinary earning awaited him. Since there was no one else around yet, he briefly considered abandoning the job and returning home. But that thought was short-lived. A black car arrived a minute later. A young man in a suit peered out, greeting Su-won and noting his early arrival. He joked that the new employee must be eager to start. The blonde blushed, admitting it was true, then accepted the invitation to get in the car. On the way, Su-won observed the passing scenery, finding everything suspicious. He even speculated that the job might involve human trafficking, which would be a serious predicament for him. To lighten the mood, the driver asked the blonde why he chose that particular photo for his resume. Su-won explained that it was taken at the first available photo studio, to which he received a compliment that he looked much better in person. The driver then introduced himself as Lee Jin-seok. The protagonist smiled and thanked his boss for picking him up. Jin-seok, visibly surprised, clarified that he was not his boss and, like Su-won, had come to work as an ordinary caddie. The blonde hadn't expected such a well-dressed man to be doing the same job as him. However, given the incredibly high salary, it was easy to suspect something was amiss, especially since a corresponding bonus was promised for good performance. Upon learning that Su-won had never worked in such a position before, Jin-seok assured him that it was just like any other service industry job. If there were any differences with other golf courses, it was that their caddy work was a bit more versatile. They worked only with invited guests, had a flexible schedule, and few busy days, so they had to handle minor tasks during downtime. If they used ordinary people for such errands, the payments to employees would certainly be lower. Therefore, the director paid significant attention to the staff's appearance. Jin-seok continued explaining the job details, but Su-won's gaze was fixed on a crow holding a matchstick in its beak. He found it odd since such birds usually preferred shiny objects, but he decided to ignore it. Upon entering the mansion, the protagonist was astounded by its opulent interior. Jin-seok informed the director of the new employee's arrival and then excused himself, mentioning that a client had arrived. Left alone, Su-won began examining everything in sight, most captivated by the paintings on the ceilings. Suddenly, someone shoved his shoulder so hard that he almost lost his balance. He turned to apologize, but instead met the stern gaze of Director Jang, whom he knew nothing about. The man merely smirked, saying it was fine, then continued on his way. Su-won was genuinely frightened by the stranger's aura and intimidating appearance. He recalled how Jin-seok had told him during the ride that their guests were VIPs with prominent names, leading him to assume this man was one of them. For the rest of the day, Su-won was briefed on the job and its nuances and shown the places he would be working. By the end, he was given his own room, where he immediately collapsed on the bed without even changing. Thoughts filled his head, but the main conclusion was that he had worried in vain. As soon as Su-won fell into a deep sleep, a blood-covered man appeared before him. It was a hallucination he had long been accustomed to, so he simply turned over. The next day, work was already in full swing. Su-won watched as Jin-seok praised his client while she played golf. The blonde tried to mimic his colleague's actions, but mistakes slipped through. Jin-seok addressed these immediately, politely reminding him how to perform various tasks better. Though it was his first day, he should have tried harder. Su-won understood everything, but what constantly bothered him was the overly tight clothing. From subsequent events, the protagonist surmised that Jin-seok and the client were lovers, given their less-than-professional behavior. Unhappy with her game, Jin-kyung extended her hand with a cigarette between her fingers, which Su-won promptly lit. Taking a short break, the group began discussing Director Jang in all his aspects. All the rumors Su-won heard from them seemed horribly disgusting and strange. Nevertheless, he had to pretend to know nothing. Confidentiality about clients was the first rule of the charter. If the protagonist had known at that moment just how filthy Director Jang was, he wouldn't have felt an ounce of sympathy for him. Su-won's duties included collecting laundry, which he began doing the next morning. That day, Kim Mi-ran won, whom the boy accompanied unsurprisingly, as Jin-kyung had been busy caressing Jin-seok. Su-won wondered if all the caddies were like this, but he knew for sure that all the clients here were. The previous day, Su-won pretended not to notice a middle-aged man bringing another woman to his room and received a generous tip for it. The boy decided that if he simply did his assigned job and stayed out of such matters, he could earn the money he needed. His last task was servicing the penthouse, a place reserved for VIP guests requiring the utmost attention. Su-won felt tense, but despite this, continued his work, knocking gently on the door. After several seconds of no response, he decided to enter, giving a prior warning. The door opened, and unexpectedly, a young girl flew out, falling right onto the protagonist. Without a word, she got up and ran away as fast as she could, leaving Su-won staring after her. From the badge the girl dropped, he learned she was also a Caddie, but why she fled the room so abruptly remained a mystery. The boy didn't know what to do next until Director Jang emerged, interrupting his thoughts. They exchanged glances, and after a moment, Su-won realized they had met before. Regaining his composure, the protagonist stated he would clean up quickly and leave, then entered the room. The inside was in a terrible mess, unsettling him to the core, making him want to leave as soon as possible. Jang lounged in one of the chairs, lighting a cigarette, and began watching the Caddie intently. Su-won noticed a ring on the man's right-hand ring finger, indicating he was married. The director asked if the boy was new, and upon receiving an affirmative answer, tossed him a large tip without a word. The protagonist understood he needed to act as if he saw nothing, so he briefly thanked the man for his generosity. When Su-won finished cleaning and was about to leave, Jang asked him to look at his chest after exiting the room. The boy didn't quite understand what he meant, but as soon as he shut the door and glanced down, he was overwhelmed with shame. Through the thin uniform, it was evident how much he had sweated, along with other body details. Despite this, the main reason remained that the room Su-won had just been in was chilling to the bone. In the evening, after finishing his work and having some free time, the first thing he did was go to a phone booth to call home. The conversation was unpleasant because his uncle started by accusing him of not answering calls. The protagonist defended himself and asked for more time to repay the debt, but the man was uninterested. So he raised the amount to 3 million won, which was a crushing blow for the boy. Su-won declared he could never repay such an amount in his lifetime, but his uncle didn't care at all. During the conversation, the protagonist experienced another hallucination, so he missed the rest of the words. Hanging up, the boy slid down the wall, clutching his head. The stated amount was beyond his means. Even with generous tips, he simply wouldn't have enough time, and even with the first paycheck, it still wouldn't suffice. Jin-suk seemed far wealthier in comparison. Deciding not to think about him, Su-won hastily wiped away his tears, recalling Jang, who might leave a generous tip again tomorrow. But if the protagonist had known what awaited him with that man, he would never have rejoiced at his money. The next day brought a dreary rain, leaving the girls with no option but to play cards. Their conversation meandered from one topic to another as Kim reached for another cigarette, only to find the pack empty. Irritated, the brunette tossed the pack aside and asked Su-won to fetch a new one. But the boy had anticipated this and had prepared in advance. Kim was thrilled with the Caddie and began openly praising him in front of everyone, while Jin-suk silently appreciated his colleague's progress. Reaching out, the girl kissed him on the cheek and handed him a substantial tip. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Director Jang appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with displeasure. Regardless, he was certain everyone would have a good time and unhesitatingly joined the card game. Su-won recognized Jang from the previous day, and judging by his expression, he was displeased about something. The man had been more amiable yesterday, and this change in demeanor made the boy uneasy. Kim casually asked if it was true that Su-won was seeing the director for the first time. The protagonist flinched, finally fully grasping the situation and who he had encountered yesterday. Regaining his composure just in time, the boy replied that they had met the day before when he was cleaning his room. The group laughed, and then Jang asked Kim how she liked the new Caddie, who praised Su-won with obvious pleasure, ending with a light slap on his backside. The boy blushed scarlet with embarrassment, especially under the man's gaze, which seemed to hold both disdain and a smirk. Su-won disliked being ridiculed. He wasn't like Jin-suk and typically wouldn't tolerate such things. If he, like the others, had been wealthy from the start, the treatment would undoubtedly be different. The company continued playing cards, and once again, the director won the pot, much to Kim's displeasure. She asked Su-won to gather all the matches scattered across the table. Each one represented 1 million won, and there were 52 in total. In just 10 minutes, Yang had amassed 52 million won, and the protagonist couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy. The man noticed, watching the caddy collect the matches, and mockingly asked if he was coveting them. Su-won was caught off guard, stammering that he couldn't even dream of such money. He almost apologized, but Jang interrupted, explaining that greed shouldn't be hidden, adding that he himself was an even greedier man. The boy fell silent, realizing the director easily understood the feelings of someone as ordinary as him. Su-won even began to think that the man wasn't as intimidating as he first seemed. Suddenly, Jang poured a glass of whiskey and offered it to the caddy, suggesting he trade one match for one glass. With trembling hands, the protagonist grasped the glass and drank it in one gulp. The burning sensation was so intense that he coughed and fell to his knees. As he struggled to recover, Yang, without a word, poured the entire bottle of whiskey over his head. Then he declared that this time, for one glass, he would give 5 matches. The company erupted in laughter at the scene, and Su-won felt immense shame, not knowing where to hide. The protagonist didn't remember how he passed out, but he soon woke from a terrible dream, accompanied by a headache and dry mouth. He opened his eyes to see Jang sitting on him, and before he could ask a question, the man thrust his own ID card in his face. With a mocking tone, he stated that he knew the ID was fake. However, the higher-ups had turned a blind eye, expecting the boy to find some use. Su-won continued to feign ignorance, and then Jang proposed investigating the theft of money, which would reveal the whole truth. Naturally, the protagonist didn't want such an outcome, so the man had another proposal: repayment with his own body. Such a proposition was unacceptable for Su-won. However, when Jang mentioned the sum of 5 million won for each night spent with him, the boy began to reconsider. 4 nights would yield him 20 million won, and considering this could continue until the end of winter, it was an unimaginable amount of money. The director left the promised tips on the bedside table and gave the caddy 3 days to think it over. He also stated that during this time, Su-won could simply take the money and run away to wherever he wished. Furthermore, the man allowed him to sleep in his bed, while he would stay in a distant room. But if Su-won decided sooner, he could come to him without any issues. Once the director disappeared behind the door, the boy hastily grabbed his belongings and rushed out, only to bump into an unfamiliar caddy. In his hurry, he didn't notice he had dropped his ID card. All he wanted was to flee as far away from this nightmare as possible. Stopping by one of the rooms, Su-won was startled to hear a girl's scream from behind the door, begging for the torment to stop and to be left alone. He finally understood the true nature of Director Jang and decided not to linger in the penthouse any longer. Running through the pouring rain, the boy headed to the spot where he had hidden his previously earned money. Finding a rock, Su-won used it as a tool to dig up his stash. By combining all the money he had earned and fleeing, he could escape from this dreadful fate. However, the protagonist decided to think a bit longer. After all, he still had 3 days left. Although the director had said he could run, it was still unknown what he was truly capable of. Su-won needed to stuff his pockets as quickly as possible and hide on some small island if he was lucky. The next day, while performing his caddy duties, the boy appeared somewhat dejected, which Kim immediately noticed. Not only Kim, everyone else noticed too and knew that the boy had spent the previous night with the director, so they began openly discussing it. In the end, it didn't interest them much, and Kim, changing the subject, handed Su-won a tip, asking him to fetch a new pack of cigarettes. However, the boy didn't need to, as he had prepared for this in advance. Pulling a pack from his pocket, he handed it to the girl. Seeing how diligently the caddy performed his work, Kim pulled out several large bills from her wallet, but instead of handing them to him, she tucked them into his waistband, praising him. The protagonist smiled modestly at this gesture, telling himself that it was just a little longer to endure. In 2 days, a minibus would be departing for the employees, presenting an excellent opportunity to escape from the penthouse. But he had overlooked one detail. One day, Su-won learned that his entire schedule for the rest of the day was canceled, allowing him to relax. The man in charge of the schedules reminded him that this wouldn't affect his salary and was considered paid leave that didn't impact his regular wages. The protagonist thanked him for the explanation and was about to leave when he accidentally dropped his folder. It contained records of all the people he had interacted with, but the names were strangely written. Director Jang was listed without a surname, leading Su-won to conclude that, like him, Jang had something to hide. In any case, the schedule cancellation meant the boy wouldn't receive any tips today. He didn't know what to do, as he needed to quickly accumulate as much money as possible before leaving. In the corridor, Soo-won noticed two caddies openly discussing him. He couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but it was clear they were talking about seeing him in Director Jang's room. Unexpectedly, Jin-seok called out to him, bringing him back to reality. The protagonist hoped he wouldn't be summoned for entertainment, but instead, his colleague invited him to room 420, where a VIP meeting was taking place. According to Jin-seok, it was a unique opportunity to hit the jackpot with tips, and Soo-won had no choice but to agree. The only request was to bring food to the room, which the boy successfully did, though he found it a bit odd to serve simple food to such people. As soon as the protagonist opened the door to the room, he froze in horror. The scene before him was not what he had expected. He was paralyzed with shock, but quickly came to his senses when one of the girls pounced on the food. Despite its plain appearance, it was in high demand. Suddenly, someone in the room shouted for seconds, and before Soo-won could move, people started stuffing money into his clothes. Men and women competed to tip him more, discussing his body among themselves, making the protagonist feel deeply uncomfortable. After several minutes of this torment, they finally pushed him out the door to fetch more food. But instead, Soo-won sprinted to the place where he had buried his previously earned money. No matter how much he thought, he couldn't continue like this. The boy wanted to take all the money and run away immediately. Digging up the stash, the protagonist found it empty. All the money was gone, though no one could have known he had hidden it there. On the day Soo-won fled Jang's room, he had lost his ID card. The colleague who found it hadn't returned it, likely guessing about the money hidden in the blanket. So Soo-won, without hesitation, returned to the penthouse and attacked the guy with his fists, saying nothing. A fight broke out in the corridor in front of everyone, with one caddy relentlessly accusing the other, who kept defending himself, claiming ignorance. However, the fight didn't last long. Security guards seized the protagonist and led him away. Soo-won felt nothing but bitterness. All the money he had painstakingly collected had vanished. After being released, the boy's first action was to wash up, contemplating how miserable his life had become. A house built on a steep slope had marked the beginning of all his troubles. As in any dysfunctional family, whenever his father was drunk, he would grab his son and mother and beat them mercilessly. In the alcohol-reeking shack, there was no hope of rescue, all because of money, which is why the protagonist was always so greedy for it. Changing into clean clothes, Soo-won returned to room 420 where he found Jang. The man invited him in, immediately asking what business brought him there. Swallowing loudly, Soo-won quickly approached the chair and fell to his knees before the director, staring at him with a desperate look. Seeing his tear-streaked eyes, Jang asked why he had been crying. Soo-won, struggling for words, explained that all his money had vanished. As expected, the man showed not the slightest bit of sympathy, instead asking why the boy came to him instead of dying. He could see from Soo-won's eyes that he couldn't survive without those pathetic scraps of paper, so he asked again while the boy was still unable to respond. Moreover, the 3-day grace period had already passed, so Jang stopped showing any courtesy to the caddy. Grabbing one of the boys sitting near the chair, Yang led him to the balcony, asking Soo-won if he knew what was happening to the guests. Without waiting for a reply, he explained that they had all consumed special stimulants, leaving them in constant seizures. The innocent boy was pushed off the balcony, and the protagonist, fearing for him, rushed to see what had happened. The boy was alive, but now Soo-won had to worry about his own life. Jang had deliberately tripped him, causing him to fall painfully to the floor. What happened next would haunt the protagonist in his nightmares, yet he received the promised money for it. The next day, a doctor arrived to check on Soo-won and ensure he was all right. Jang had summoned him, not wanting his toy to unexpectedly be unable to perform its functions. After the doctor left, Jang received a call about Soo-won. His superior was pleased to hear that the employee was providing satisfactory service. He also promised to completely clear Soo-won's schedule, allowing Jang to use the boy as he pleased. The previous night, the superior had personally visited Soo-won's room, telling him not to worry about the schedule and to focus on an important client. As a result, Soo-won moved from a small shack without a window to an excellent room next to Director Jang's suite. Left alone, Soo-won collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, pondering what kind of person Jang truly was. He knew nothing about him except that he hosted numerous guests and managed large-scale trades. Suddenly, the man returned to the room, startling the protagonist. Soo-won jumped up, guiltily averting his gaze at the man's outburst. However, Yang disliked this reaction. warning the boy that he detested people without manners. He must always look at him. Su-won had no choice but to obey. He suddenly wondered if the director's loved ones knew his true nature. Despite the doctor's recent warnings, Jang once again used the boy against his will. The protagonist awoke at dawn, alone in a cold bed, with no memory of when he had passed out. Deciding not to linger, he quickly dressed and grabbed the wallet that had been given to him. It contained a substantial amount of money, and there was a bite mark on its edge from Su-won. The man had said that if he could hold on to it, he could keep the entire sum, which he had managed to do. Arriving at a phone booth, he dialed the familiar number and waited for someone to pick up, paying no attention to the girls observing him. They were discussing Su-won's body, his face, and how Director Jang might regard him. From their conversation, the protagonist learned many things, but none aligned with reality. It was nothing like what the girls described. Finally, the call was answered, and the boy immediately told his uncle that he had just deposited 5 million won into the account. As agreed, 3 million for the man, 1 million for his mother's medical expenses, and 1 million to pay off his father's debts. The conversation seemed to be over, but Su-won became curious about his mother's condition. The uncle was not gentle, stating that she was lying in the hospital and draining money, and that the protagonist must continue to send payments monthly. With that, the man hung up, leaving Su-won deep in thought. The boy leaned against the booth wall and sighed heavily, realizing he had nowhere else to turn. Returning to his room, the protagonist took the elevator, still lost in thought. Suddenly, the light began to flicker and crackle suspiciously, causing Su-won to startle visibly. Turning around, he saw another hallucination in the mirror. His legs buckled treacherously, and his hands reached up to rub his eyes. Regaining his composure, Su-won entered the room and immediately dived under the bed. He hid the wallet with the money there, determined that no one would dare take what was rightfully his. The boy had to protect at least this, and his mind was consumed with one word: money. After some time, a Caddie girl peeked into the room with a food delivery. Taking the food, Su-won watched her leave, wondering why Jang had chosen him when the golf club was filled with similar individuals. Following the room service, the director himself arrived, and the protagonist tried to be as respectful as possible. But the man simply stripped off his clothes and, before heading to the shower, asked the boy to prepare for his return. Once he was done with the shower, Yang started eating, leaving Su-won to watch. However, he didn't stand idle for long. Soon, the man called the Caddie over, forcing him to cater to his every whim. After yet another encounter, the protagonist felt despondent but continued to fulfill his duties, as money was money. While standing at the reception waiting for a check-in, a girl suddenly approached him. A new trainee Caddie, introducing herself as Lee Hye-won. Jin-suk had warned him earlier about the incoming trainee, but Su-won had no objections since he only needed to keep an eye on her just in case. Soon, they both arrived at the gathering spot for clients. Director Jang and Supervisor Kim met their accompanying caddies and then headed to the golf course. The game was in full swing, with the men competing fiercely, and Kim, noticing he was losing, asked his caddy to demonstrate the correct way to play and win. Hye-won, seeing how the man was getting handsy with her colleague, was both shocked and embarrassed by such behavior. Understanding her feelings, Su-won asked the girl to prepare and bring drinks for the guests. Hye-won nodded in agreement and was about to leave when Kim intercepted her, groping and showering her with compliments. The girl, frightened, thanked him with a trembling voice and hurried away. Even Su-won was shaken by such behavior. A second later, he saw Jang's disapproving look, clearly indicating that the boy was handling his job poorly. Suddenly, the man's phone rang, allowing them to avoid an awkward pause in conversation. The game soon resumed and lasted until the evening. Kim, visibly tired, suggested continuing their heartfelt discussions over a drink after such a productive workout. Jang declined, stating he had another appointment, which meant only one thing for Su-won. He would spend the rest of the day in peace. However, the protagonist wasn't sure if he should be truly happy about this, as it would be better to get the money quickly, gather the needed amount, and leave. In any case, since today's session had ended, it meant Jang would finally meet with the owner of the ring identical to his own. Finishing the remaining tasks, Su-won walked down the corridor, not expecting to see the director waiting for him. The man ordered him to follow, and soon they found themselves in a rather beautiful restaurant, greeted by a waitress. The entire way, the protagonist remained silent, mentally speculating about Jang's wife. Perhaps she was as selfish as the other club visitors. Or maybe she was a chaebol heiress, raised in love and understanding, unaware of this side of her husband. In any case, there must be a reason why the man had brought Su-won here, so the boy needed to stay vigilant. After dinner, Yang, as expected, took the boy to his room to satisfy his needs once again. When it was over, he ordered Su-won to clean himself up, warning that he would send someone to him. He needed to dress neatly to avoid looking as disheveled as he had in the restaurant, where he had attracted unwanted attention. The protagonist felt increasingly weighed down by the director's constant anger. Today, the man was displeased again, leaving without giving him any money. Unexpectedly, there was a knock on the door, and Su-won rushed to open it. As promised, a man arrived, carrying a small safe. The boy didn't understand what was happening, but once he took the safe into the room and opened it, everything became clear. At the bottom of the safe lay several million won. During their physical encounters, Yang had mentioned he had already paid Su-won enough, but for his excellent service, he was willing to pay much more. The protagonist's mind kept urging him to take all the money, jump out of the window, and flee. But even with such a large sum, he couldn't fill the void. Not his own, but Jang's. The next day, Su-won went to the store, where he bought some food and sent money to his uncle through an ATM. At the checkout, he ran into a girl he had accompanied before, and seeing how she was holding up the line due to her mistake, he paid for her as well. She wanted to thank her colleague, but the boy didn't want to talk to anyone, so he brushed her off, saying he had a meeting with a client, and then hurried away, disappearing from sight. Soon, Su-won started his work, serving drinks while the clients were engrossed in a board game. The girl, noticing the bruises on the Caddie's neck, seemed to mock him and Jang by openly discussing their time together in front of everyone. She also mentioned that the man had been worried about him in recent days, which noticeably surprised Su-won. Jang didn't want to sit and listen to the discussion any longer, so he decided to leave first. His Caddie followed him, and soon they were both silently riding the elevator to the desired floor. Deciding to start a conversation, the man asked Su-won how someone with such an innocent face could beat up a person. The protagonist expected any question but this one, and before he could respond, Jang explained that he had personally dealt with the incident to avoid unnecessary fuss. However, he was still curious why Su-won had hit him, and the Caddie explained that the boy had stolen his money. Initially, Jang didn't believe him, asking a few more questions, but then he eventually agreed that the boy was telling the truth. The protagonist couldn't stop marveling at how this man behaved. Yesterday, he was tormenting him, and today, he was concerned. Entering the room, the man stepped on a cream bun that Su-won had bought that morning. It turned into mush. Jang was both surprised and displeased that despite the money the Caddie earned, he couldn't afford proper food. The director even suggested that the boy had spent his money on a hidden gigolo, which made Su-won laugh uncontrollably. However, his laughter didn't last long. The man sat down on the couch and then gave the usual commands, and the boy had no choice but to obey.